Welcome to the Calm Analytics channel. I'm Borys Tizengauzen. Today is September 24th, and wow, there is some news. In this episode, the port of Novorossiysk is currently under attack. Trump has seriously insulted the Kremlin and has already received a response, and according to Donald Trump, Ukraine can reclaim its territories and not just those. So what happened? Why did Trump decide to radically change his approach to Ukraine? And also about how Orban is entering into a serious conflict with the US, openly siding with Putin. Ukrainian drones are striking Gazprom and new oil refineries, and Poland is finally opening its border with Belarus. And also about how Putin meets with the head of the so-called LNR and listens, very, very bored, to talk about ramps for legless people whom he'll have to find somewhere to put after this war. All this and more in today's episode. There will be a lot of interesting things, so if you're new to this channel, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. So, at this very moment as I'm recording this video, Novorossiysk, a key port of the Russian Federation and a naval base located there, is under attack by drones. Moreover, the attack is coming both from the air and from the sea. In the footage I saw, an unmanned boat is already it's rushing at full speed into the bay, and they're shooting at it. The residents of Novorossiysk are shouting, "Shoot, shoot!" but it's speeding along and they can't hit it. In the end, the unmanned boat turns directly toward the boat from which the shooting is coming. And in fact, that's where the recording ends. Basically, these videos are impossible to watch, just so you understand. There's so much swearing going on. But the residents of Novorossiysk are very surprised that they're getting visitors both from the air and from the sea. Guests have arrived, and they were also shooting down drones over the city. Naturally, no one cares about the residents, but they do care about the ships. In general, there will soon be visual confirmation since everyone saw everything. And if you're from that area, you can write in the comments. However, the fact that the surface drones went straight in, already entered the bay, and approached the ships means there won't be much good news for the Russians. But accordingly for us, for the Cossacks, there will be a lot. The port of Novorossiysk, the port of Ust-Luga, these are, as they say, Koshchei's two eggs. That's where the bald death is lurking. And finally, they started targeting them, seriously targeting them. And many were probably surprised by Donald Trump's statement yesterday about Ukraine and about Russia. However, there are a few points that I would still like to draw attention to. That is, of course, yesterday's statement from Trump is the most pro-Ukrainian of all those that came before. But does this mean that the White House's strategy is changing and the pendulum, as they say, has swung toward Ukraine? First, let's look at the statement itself. I believe that Ukraine, with the support of the European Union, is capable of winning and regaining all of its territory in its original form over time, with patience and with financial support from Europe, particularly NATO. Reaching the borders from which this war began is quite realistic. And this is Trump. Let me remind you, he says, why not? Russia has been fighting aimlessly for 3.5 years in a war that a real military power should have won in less than a week. You are seriously underestimating Ukraine, Donald Trump. This doesn't set Russia apart. In fact, it makes it look like a paper tiger. And he also added, after I learned about and fully understood the military and economic situation in Ukraine, as well as saw the economic problems that exist in Russia, I think that Ukraine, with the support of the European Union, is capable of fighting and reclaiming all its territory in its original form. That's how it is. He also added that when people living in Moscow and in all the big cities and towns across Russia find out what's really happening with this war, the fact that soon it will be almost impossible for them to get gasoline and everything else that's happening in their military economy where most of their money is being spent on fighting Ukraine. With Ukraine, added Donald Trump, which has a great spirit and is only getting stronger. And Ukraine will not only be able to reclaim its territory, but even go further, said Trump. Putin's Russia is in big economic trouble. Let's put it this way, they have major economic problems. Now is the time for Ukraine to act. In any case, I wish both countries all the best. We will continue to supply NATO with weapons so that NATO can do whatever it wants with them. Good luck to everyone by Pokichmoki. That's how it is. Listen, well, really, not only did he say it just like that, but he also repeated at the meeting with Macron that the occupied territories must return under Ukraine's control. Well, that's a great statement, super. But before that, there were other statements saying you shouldn't start a war against someone bigger than you. There were ultimatums, deadlines, all of which have already passed. And Trump was dissatisfied with Ukraine as well, just as he was dissatisfied with Russia. In a week, there might be another statement. That's why these emotional swings are very typical. So a huge thank you to Donald Trump for the kind words, and a huge thank you for the weapons for NATO as well. We are waiting for it. Well, let's watch Donald Trump himself and, most importantly, his team. That is, if his team picks it up inertially and it turns into something, if it somehow is shaped into a different strategy of helping Ukraine so that Ukraine can reclaim its territories, then of course that will be not just words, but words backed by action. And Trump keeps saying that Putin is in trouble with the economy, so if there are additional measures, if sanctions are finally imposed, or if there are strikes against the Shadow Fleet, then we'll understand that this is a strategy, not just words. And this is what caught my attention. A real military power would have won this war in a week. For example, I consider the US Army to be a real military power. But a 100,000 strong force couldn't accomplish anything in Afghanistan in 20 years. They poured $1 billion, almost $1 trillion into it, and then quickly retreated from there. So, who or what is this supposed super military power? It's not about whether the Russian army is real or not, it is absolutely real. And the huge hordes of these ghouls, they are real too. The equipment, the Kinzhal missiles flying, the Iskanders, it's all real. The point is, Ukraine turned out to be too much for the Russian Federation to handle. And let me remind the United States once again, I want to emphasize that I consider the US Army to be real. A very real military force. But there was also the Vietnam War, which lasted 20 years. So in theory, you could say a real military force could have taken Vietnam in 2 weeks. But it didn't work out that way. In the end, it was a defeat, with tens of thousands killed, about 60,000, and hundreds of thousands wounded, leaving the nation traumatized for many, many years. So when it comes to real military power, everything is real. But now let's talk about the most real military force of all. Let me remind you, friends, we are raising funds for the legendary 3rd Assault Brigade. The commanders from the 3rd Assault Brigade have recorded a message for us. Please take a look.
Greetings, friends. My call sign is Talbot. I am the commander of the Revenge crew of the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade, FPV Strike Company. I'm reaching out to the viewers of Borys Tizengauzen's channel with a request to help raise funds for Matrice 30 daytime drones.
These are large copters. We need them for reconnaissance. And they also perform some other very interesting functions. The fundraising amount is significant, 1,100,000 hryvnias. We are counting on your support, on your help. Thanks to them, we will be able to destroy the enemy even more effectively and bring Ukraine's victory closer.
Glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes.
And as for the drones ending up in the very skilled hands of the 3rd Assault Brigade fighters, there's no doubt about that. Those guys are real aces, let me tell you. Drones in the hands of the 3rd Assault Brigade are both a weapon and a holy fire raining down on the heads of all these occupiers. Believe me, these ghouls, they'll be blown to bits from the sky. They won't even realize what hit them. So let's help our defenders from the legendary 3rd Brigade. The link to donate to the Assault Brigade is in the description of this video. There's Monobank, there are private bank details, and PayPal for those who want to help from abroad, for which I always say a huge thank you. Naturally, friends, in the Kremlin, they just couldn't ignore Trump's statements about the paper tiger, and that Ukraine will get its territories back, maybe even more. But since Putin is a typical coward, pardon my French, they did what they always do. Putin doesn't speak himself, he just says, release Medvedev. But here it's not exactly a paper tiger, more like a paper jackal, or what was it, a lurking jackal, a skulking moth. In this case, they nudged Medvedev in his doghouse, and here's the response he gave. Well, not him, someone wrote it for him. Donald Trump, who recently stated that Ukraine might regain its territories, will soon change his rhetoric and viewpoint to the opposite, Medvedev also said. According to him, after meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, Trump once again ended up in an alternative reality. Here it is, word for word. I have no doubt he will return from this alternative reality. Trump, that is. He always comes back. The main thing is to radically change your point of view on all sorts of issues as often as possible, and everything will be fine. This, Medvedev says, is the essence of successful state governance through social media. That's how he concluded his thought. Well, if anyone knows, he certainly does. All right, so what is the essence of state governance through social media? But he decided to troll Trump this way. You get it, right? Like, keep changing, and you'll definitely come back. Although, in my opinion, life has trolled Medvedev pretty well too. He spent his whole life as Putin's test run and temporary substitute. But that's not even the worst of it yet. Medvedev, in general, reminds me of a grotesque villain from children's plays, in theaters. He doesn't even play the main villain like Barmaly, but rather one of the two henchmen. The second henchman, for example, doesn't even have a name. The actor is always hungover, the makeup is terrible, there's a dead beaver on his head instead of a wig, and he feels awful. He yells, his role is to shout twice and fire a toy gun once. He feels awful, but he still has to perform. And so his breath reeks of alcohol, hitting the kids in the front rows. But he thinks he's scary. Like, I'll write this, I'll show them now. But he only scares the children. Adults just look at him and feel sorry for him. Or, it's kind of, it's this mixed feeling. That's what Medvedev is like, I think, honestly. If you want to threaten people in a comical, grotesque way, just send out Medvedev. Well, Putin decided to shake up Russians a bit more, by the way. He's raising VAT from 20 to 22%. And here you need to understand that everything you buy in Russia, for any purchase now, part of that money goes to the war. In other words, there's not enough money left over. Putin needs more. Russians will always pay for the war. And Trump and Orban have fallen out. Hungary has refused to stop purchasing energy resources from Russia, despite demands from Donald Trump. They have categorically refused to stop buying Russian oil and gas. Well, Budapest claims that there is no physical infrastructure to replace Russian hydrocarbons with other supplies. They're lying. Of course they're lying. Meanwhile, Hungary's foreign minister Péter Szijjártó called the European officials who have been demanding for 3 years that Hungary pursue diversification fanatics with whom it is absolutely impossible to have a rational dialogue. Let me just remind you that for every euro Hungary gives to the European Union budget, Hungary receives 2 euros from the budget. In other words, twice as much. In my opinion, these fanatics, as Hungary's foreign minister called them, should reconsider their approach toward those who favor Russian oil. And in Budapest, they understand Trump's approach, but they can't secure alternative supplies for themselves. He stated quite emphatically that it's physically impossible. Of course it's possible. That's complete nonsense. Just reconfigure your refinery to process a different type of oil, not Russian Urals. Alternative routes exist, including by sea and then overland, but yes, it will be more expensive and organizationally more complicated, yet achievable with certain investments and agreements. So all of this is just talk, and it could have been done long ago. And as for the claim that Hungary and Slovakia have no access to the sea, well, look at the Czech Republic. It also has no access to the sea. If only someone could tell Donald Trump that Orban switched him out for Russian oil. And here's another question, by the way. If they start imposing tariffs against those who buy Russian oil, India, China against Hungary and Slovakia, and also against Turkey. You know what's most interesting? The headline of this news literally reads as follows. Hungary will refuse Trump if he asks them not to buy Russian oil. And the most interesting thing is that yesterday Trump stated that if he asks, then Orban will stop buying Russian oil. But after that, it turns out that no, we will refuse Trump. That's why I started with the news that we shouldn't get too excited. Tomorrow, Donald Trump might change his rhetoric. And by the way, it seems that he didn't even ask Orban about it. As they say with Orban, return the sand molds, we're no longer friends. It's all very simple here. Orban has been in power for almost 19 years, with a break. He was there for 4 years, then a break, and now he's been sitting in that chair for 15 years straight. He understands perfectly well that he still has to build relations with Putin for a long time, at least until one of them is gone. Unless someone takes care of him with some proper bug spray, for Trump this is his last term. That's it. Orban only cares about those who are more important to him, those who supply him with shadow cash. Just wait a little, and soon he'll be able to guzzle Russian oil with both hands again, once Trump's term is over. So for Orban, Trump is just a situational ally, while Putin is a long-term one. That's how Orban sees it. Same goes for China. So Orban is stuck doing the splits, trying to balance all of this. Soon, the province will crack under him, by the way, friends. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and welcome to our corner of sanity. There are already 453,000 of us. That's basically a city. That's a whole city. The Vatican has a population of 760 people, so we've gathered 600 Vaticans here. As they say, move over, Pope. Soon we'll catch up to Iceland, which has a population of 356,000. So we have more people here than the entire population of Iceland. That's pretty serious. When we hit 1 million, I think we'll have to start thinking about our own country. That would be a good idea. So we've talked about the Hungarians, the Magyars, and specifically about one of them, Orban. That was the smoker's version of a Magyar. And now let's talk about the healthy person's Magyar. Ukrainian drones have attacked Gazprom's petrochemical complex in Bashkortostan for the second time this week. This time the Salavat plant, Gazprom Neftekim Salavat, was hit hard. It was a serious hit, meaning they finished the job this time. Let me remind you, that's 1,500 kilometers from the Russian-Ukrainian border. This is the second attack in a week, meaning they zeroed in and hit it really well. In other words, this is one of the largest production complexes for oil refining and petrochemicals, a very significant target. And in the Volgograd region, the Lukoil refinery was also hit. They finished it off as well. It's one of the major ones, processing almost 15 million tons of oil per year. That's a very serious high-value target, so it was struck a second time too. There was an initial strike, and now they've hit it again. So, as I understand it, they're going for a second round. Meanwhile, the fuel crisis is getting worse and worse. Russian regions are really starting to feel it. So soon, I think people there will be scrambling for gasoline. And NATO intends to respond decisively to Russia's reckless actions, according to a statement from the North Atlantic Council. Russia should have no doubt that NATO and its allies will use all necessary military and non-military means for self-defense and deterrence. The Russian Ministry of Defense continues to claim that they did not violate anyone's airspace, stating that their flights were conducted in accordance with international regulations. Well, they're lying, of course, although now evidence should be presented. Look, responding decisively is absolutely the right thing to do. I'm not trolling NATO right now, well, maybe just a little. But until the first aerial target is shot down, specifically a Russian one, an airplane or helicopter that violates the airspace, all of this will remain just statements. In fact, a decisive response would be a statement that pilots have been instructed to shoot down aerial targets that violate the airspace of NATO countries and do not respond to communication. But another very good step would be to respond to the Russian Federation in kind. For example, if Poland were to accidentally provide its airspace to our Ukrainian drones, just as Belarus did for Russian drones, and they would fly in formation toward the Kaliningrad region, where there are a lot of interesting targets, by the way. In fact, it would even be possible to deal with that giant electronic warfare station that's causing interference. Well, we could help our allies with that. So, something like that. 20 drones accidentally, we had no idea, we didn't shoot them down. So what's the problem? Well, you could shoot down one just for show, like Lukashenko did. By the way, people always use Erdogan as an example, and I do too, who shot down a Russian plane in just 17 seconds. Supposedly that's decisive? Yes, that's decisive, but let me give you a different statistic. As of September 2025, there have been 369 lost planes and helicopters on the Russian side. Destroyed by the Ukrainian side, 369. That's where it is. That's where you can take masterclasses. And speaking of decisiveness here, Poland is decisively reopening its border with Belarus on September 25th. So apparently they've reached an agreement. They closed it because of the Zapad 2025 exercises. Chinese emissaries, an entire minister came over. Please, our transit. Nothing worked, no way. The Russian troops left and went back. And Poland is reopening the border. I think now Lukashenko will let a couple out. Instead of political prisoners, they'll hand over some migrant who is most likely being held somewhere in Belarusian prisons. The very one who, I think, struck a Polish border guard with a stick and a knife, after which the guard died. Now they'll hand him over. Now Lukashenko will do everything by the book, and Chinese transit will go through the Belarusian border into the European Union. But there was a tool to put pressure on Russia through China. And you could see how everyone in China started scrambling. Well, it's clear that Poland is acting in its own personal economic interests. But let me remind you, if it weren't for Ukraine, no one would be thinking about any personal economic interests anymore. Russian troops would already be standing who knows where. Somewhere far out west. And one more thing, I couldn't pass by this news. Putin held a meeting with a beekeeper. This is the head of the so-called self-proclaimed LPR. And this beekeeper told him about the restoration of housing, communications, and most importantly, about measures to support these ghouls, occupiers, participants in the military operation, as they call them. They also discussed issues of water supply, attention, mine reclamation, and forest planting. Honestly, I just recently watched this really interesting video, and this particular beekeeper was saying that they had opened some brand new office specifically for these deserving war veterans. And the beekeeper said, we even built a ramp there, for those who lost their legs or arms. We even made them a ramp. Wow, how generous of them. I'm curious, with these occupiers who are without legs or arms, will the Soviet practice be applied to them? Will they be sent to a veterans' home somewhere like Valam or Solovki? So, in Moscow they'll build ramps for them, but out in the provinces on Russian roads, even a healthy person would break their legs. By the way, don't you want to do some mine reclamation in Donetsk as well? And plant a little forest? I mean, in the region there's simply no water at all. They've turned it into a dump, a sewage ditch, and now they want to plant a forest. They'll find money for that. In 12 years, they haven't built a water supply system. That's Russia for you, by the way. Whatever it touches turns into a swamp. Soon, in Donetsk, they'll be able to film a new Mad Max episode. When gangs of crazed thugs race across the dried-up desert in rusty wrecks, fighting each other for gasoline. For clean water, that's what it's going to be. That's exactly what it's going to be. By the way, how are those who are waiting for the Russian world doing? Is this how you imagined it? In general, for fans of the Soviet Union and of Putin, since for him it's some kind of tragedy. Putin said that the Soviet Union collapsed. To all those fans, I recommend reading about the so-called Stalin samovars and about disabled war veterans. This is probably one of the most shameful pages in the history of the Soviet Union. Samovars was the name given to those who lost their arms and legs in the war. That's what they were called back then. And according to various estimates, about 20 million wounded returned from World War II, and about 1 million of them were disabled veterans. But when the disabled veterans started, well, there were no wheelchairs, and some of them begged on the streets because they couldn't work properly. When all this became visible, the humane authorities decided to remove the war invalids from the streets so they wouldn't spoil the joyful life of the builders of communism. For this purpose, in 1949, so-called homes for the disabled were established in remote provinces where disabled people were rounded up from major cities. And they were placed there so they wouldn't be seen, so they wouldn't spoil the joy of Soviet citizens. And one of these homes was on Valam, the place where Putin likes to pray, where he received Lukashenko. Wonderful. I think the same thing will happen with these people. For a year they'll parade around the streets with their ribbons, and then the Putin regime will quietly get rid of them somewhere. And for contrast, let me tell you a little more about the decaying West. I just remembered, for those who have been to Paris, when I went for the first time, I was surprised by the name of a metro station there. Invalides. I thought, what is this? How can that be? Later I visited the complex itself. The palace is actually called the Hôtel des Invalides. It's a palace, a whole complex, a truly beautiful place that was built during the time of Louis XIV, the Sun King. It was specifically constructed for war veterans, and later it continued to serve as a home for invalids. That's why it's called the Hotel des Invalides, and the metro station is called Invalides as well. So, that's a little something about the decaying West and their attitude toward those who lost their health fighting for their country. By the way, that's also where Napoleon's tomb is. They moved it there at one point. Have you noticed how in Russia they've started to openly and bluntly call the war a war? I saw a quote from Peskov today. I thought, wow, that's something. Let me read it to you now. Listen, there's a war going on. What is happening around us is a war. Right now, this is the most intense phase of the war. It's quite fateful. We need to win it for the sake of our children, our grandchildren, for their future. He says war 3 times, almost in a single sentence. Can someone explain why you need to win a war for the sake of children? Putin needs to win it, that's clear. But the mustachioed floozy, she understands perfectly well what she's saying when she talks about for the future. If you carefully read his phrase, this quote, everything falls into place. Listen, there is a war going on. What is happening around us is war. It's quite fateful. We need to win it for the sake of our children, our grandchildren, for their future. So I think that Peskov isn't really talking about the children and grandchildren of ordinary Russians. As for him, for Peskov, his children and grandchildren abroad will be just fine. But you, friends, take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones, and subscribe to this channel. And let's support our legendary defenders from the 3rd Assault Brigade. This fundraiser, I really ask you, they are just wow. Just like that. Wishing us all a peaceful day. And of course, glory to Ukraine.